Greetings sailors and welcome to a look at primarily HMS London, but also a little bit at the Devonshire as well. It was originally my intent just to do a video on the London, but then I ended up having a pretty decent game in the Devonshire and thought it might serve as a useful point of comparison because they are both theoretically very similar ships. They're both county class heavy cruisers. There are some fairly big and not so big differences between them, and in most ways, or well, not most ways, but in a lot of ways, a lot of important ways, London is a worse Devonshire. But the reason it's worse, the reason it gets the short and fuzzy end of the stick when you're comparing the stats, is because it has something Devonshire doesn't: a smoke. And it has paid quite heavily for having that smoke. Wargaming have, I guess, sort of to their credit, well, it's to their credit they've made a ship that isn't overpowered, and it would be surprising if they had, given that this is a ship that you can get with the current set of Royal Navy directives. But at the same time, I cannot help but feel it's paid a bit too heavily for having that smoke. So just to give you a rundown of some of the differences, it has a very short range guns, not the shortest range at tier 6. Leander, the Perth and Huang He all have a shorter range. I think Perth is the worst at 2.8, but it gets a spotter plane, which the others don't. This doesn't obviously have a spotter or catapult of any kind available. The shells are worse than the Devonshire, and this one took me a little by surprise because in theory it's the same guns and the same ammunition, but what they've actually done is they've given it the ammunition that the Exeter uses rather than it being the same ammo that the Devonshire uses. So it has a slightly higher muzzle velocity, which means the ballistics are actually pretty reasonable. But the shell damage, penetration, HE fire chance, all that kind of thing are worse. And in terms of the HE damage, the HE fire chance particularly, it's got 2% less, which doesn't sound like a huge amount, but it's noticeable, especially when you couple that with the next way in which it's worse, in that it has a second longer reload. It's tied with the Alba at 15 seconds. It's got more barrels than the Alba, which is nice, and I think the accuracy is possibly a little better. I don't have any complaints on either ship about the accuracy, but the Alba does have a longer range to work with, and the Alba does have somewhat better armour to work with as well. You know, you can at least say this over the Leander, and obviously goes for the Devonshire as well, is that the armour on these is quite good, especially with the belt for a tier 6 cruiser. If you compare it to playing the Leander or the Nuremberg or, Lord help you, the Pensacola, this thing's actually reasonably survivable. So the guns and the damage output generally is worse than the Devonshire. The torpedoes are also slightly worse in that they have less range, although they do a little more damage and they have slightly better stealth. Devonshire's torps have 8 kilometers range and I think it's 1.4 kilometers of detection, and this is 1.3, so they'll get spotted a little bit less quickly. I think the speed of them is the same, I can't remember offhand, but yeah, the extra range means that that Devonshire's torps are useful more often than these ones. And because you've only got the single launcher per side, you don't have enough to put down, say, a battleship, unless they're already reasonably well damaged. So if you're trying to charge somebody down, you'd better make sure it's under very favourable circumstances. Probably the last big way in which this is rather worse than Devonshire is the heel. Because although it does have a heal like the Devonshire, it's a worse heal and you have fewer of them. This is probably, to my mind, the biggest drawback. The guns, the rate of fire you can live with, although there is a noticeable difference in damage output between the two ships, but the far weaker heal is just that bit too much, honestly, on top of everything else it has to contend with, especially given that you have a shorter range, that you have to get that bit closer than other ships. 13.4 kilometers, especially in this tier 8 matchmaking, is pretty bad, and that's the same for all those short range ships that I mentioned. Perth actually can maybe do the best out of all of them because it has the spotter to work with, but Huang He, with its small barrel count, and obviously Leander with its excessive squashiness and the inability to set fires, all don't do that well in tier 8 games, unsurprisingly. Leander at least has longer range torps to work with. And, oh, by the way, I should mention, of course, this being a heavy cruiser, 203mm guns, you'd get less benefit out of your smoke than the light cruisers that have smoke. If you've played any of the Italian cruisers, you'll know you have to be quite careful about when firing from your smoke. Sometimes you just have to pop it for concealment purposes. With the concealment debuff from smoke when you're firing, you've only actually got about 6.6 kilometers of your entire 13.4 range that's usable. Otherwise, stuff that's closer, say a destroyer that you don't know about, is going to spot you, thereby rendering your smoke completely useless. So because you have this weak heal that only it's, I think, 10 seconds, it does I can't remember how much it heals per second. The actual damage per second it heals is not bad, but the Citadel damage it heals, it's like 10% versus I think it's 33% for a lot of other heals. So it's pretty weak, and that to me was almost the biggest difference playing this between this and the Devonshire, is how much less you can heal back. You pay a heavy price for that smoke, you really do. So, yeah, if anyone's expecting this to be comfortable, if they've played the Devonshire and thought, okay, the London is going to be a Devonshire with smoke, this is harder work by far. And I haven't played that many games in the Devonshire, but even though the range isn't that much better, it's certainly a more comfortable ship overall. And dare I say, even maybe a more fun ship. That said, though, I don't want you to think that this is a bad ship. And like I've said, it is certainly better than some of the other free to grind out via directive ships that have been available. So overall, if you were thinking about grinding this out, I would say it probably is worth it. If you were thinking about buying it, maybe. But honestly, if you wanted a smoke ship that felt more fun and effective at tier 6, I would think the Perth would be honestly by far the better choice. I mean, if nothing else, a division of Perths, or maybe, Perths and Huang He's mixed in together with that crawling smoke, can actually be quite fun. This ship, on the other hand, is never going to feel anything like less than hard work, and it's also very rarely going to be the kind of ship that can make a decisive difference in games. I mean, that's true for a lot of tier 6 cruisers, to be fair, especially when down tiered like this, but all of the other tier 6 heavy cruisers have much better range. Well, I say much better. I think Alba's 14 point something. Is it even quite a kilometre? But even, that extra kilometre does make a difference. And of course, Alba has better torps. This does have, one or two things going for it compared to other heavy cruisers out the tier, excluding Devonshire. The stealth is pretty decent overall. Devonshire actually has better stealth, which is a little unpleasant when you consider that this thing has a shorter range than Devonshire. So having that 400 or 500 meters less surface detection is, yeah, it's a bit ouchy. It's yet another way in which you are paying for having that smoke. But compared to, say, you know, Pensacola, the Alba, it's definitely a reasonably sneaky ship for the tier. It's just not as sneaky as the other smoke-using cruisers at this tier when firing from smoke, you know, especially the... well, you know, not even when firing from smoke, it just compared to the Leander, for example, it's over 1.5 kilometers worse in terms of surface detection, for example. Having said that, I haven't thought to check against the Trento. The Trento might be worse, but the Trento is also faster. Not that this is slow. Both this and the Devonshire, I think, have the same speed, and if you stick the Sierra Mike flag on, you can get to over 33 knots, so it's pretty reasonable. Although for this particular match, you might have noticed I was flying no flags at all, because this was the very first game I played in this post-patch, after it was provided to us by Wargaming. I meant to mention that at the start of the start of the video, which FTC rules, if you're an American YouTuber, you kind of have to now, to be on the safe side. If it's a provided thing, you have to say so, and I've been completely forgetting to do so. But it's you know, worth bearing in mind I very rarely have to buy premiums these days for warships. I mostly get given them for, you know, promotional and review purposes. So that's definitely the case with this one. I would not have bought this. I might have ground it out, but I don't think I would have bought it. So yeah, overall it's workable, but you have to accept that you're not going to have that big of an impact on a match. And even when you're top tier, you're basically a support ship. And if you can time those circumstances when you use your smoke correctly, just like with the Leander, if you've played the Leander, I think that's a really helpful experience for having played this ship, just in terms of getting that timing right, then yeah, you can get a bit of damage out of that smoke and be relatively worry-free, but you've paid such a hefty penalty for that smoke that, to be quite honest, having played both this and the Devonshire, for the most part, given the choice, I would play the Devonshire. And a big part of that is just the extra bit of range, the extra survivability, and also, in particular, the extra chance to do damage via fires. Because I've had some okay RNG games in terms of fires. I think I had one where I had about 20 to 25k damage done, and I managed about 75,000 overall. So that was a nice top-up, but on the other hand, I've had games where out of, I did check this, it was like 76 HE hits, and out of that I only got 2 fires, which was a bit aggravating. Because, you know, that really didn't give me a lot of extra damage at all. In fact, it was, I think, less than 1,000 damage from those 2 fires because they were so spaced apart. So the extra fire chance and the extra rate of fire on Devonshire make a big difference compared to this. Devonshire's a pretty comfortable ship to play in terms of its damage output. This, on the other hand, it's more like the Huang He. You have to fight for every bit of damage that you're going to get. And oh, by the way, did I mention it has slightly worse AA than Devonshire as well? And Devonshire has the option of defensive AA, which this does not. This only has that very short range but long duration hydro, which is typical of the other British heavy cruisers. So that was, for being bottom tier in that matchmaking, probably not a bad result, but I very much felt at the mercy of literally everyone else around me, and that's not unique to this particular ship, but in comparison in particular to the Devonshire, which is a pretty nice tier 6 cruiser, it leaves something to be desired. It really does. And although I would definitely take this over something like the Eitel Friedrich, if I was left to my own devices, I don't particularly want to play either of them. I think it pays too much of a price for that smoke to really feel like it's fun to play, or even rewarding to play as a premium. Because that's supposed to be one of the attractions, is it's a premium ship, but yeah, it definitely feels like more one of those ships that you play because you really want a challenge, and there are certainly plenty of those enough in the game already. Now, everything I've said, by the way, might be subject to revision depending on what happens with particularly the cruiser plating armour changes that happen in future. I'm doing well with words today. I've not fumbled them too badly, but I know I'm pronouncing some words with slightly weird inflections and all the rest of it, because, I don't know, that's how my brain is today, apparently. But, yeah, what was I saying? Something about, oh yeah, the cruiser plating changes. So yeah, nobody knows how that's going to work out just yet. I mean, the whole thing does seem like a pretty odd way to me to try and improve the survivability of cruisers. There are other things you could do. Personally, I would like to see London have, at the very least, the heal that Devonshire has. But if you had other cruisers have the London-style limited heal, for example, that would be a boon for every single line, essentially. And then, you know, you'd have the most of the other current cruisers that do already have a heal would still retain their much better heal. They'd be much better off overall. Anyway, that's a complete aside. That's not really to do with the Devonshire as we're seeing here. So yeah, this is again a tier 8 match. Again, not great matchmaking, although in this case the enemy team is that bit worse than they were last time. I mean, last time we ended up capping them out, and what we were doing on flank I was on was essentially delaying tactics. We were just stopping them from getting to our cap particularly, and drawing their attention away, and most of them decided to give chase rather than try and get back to where they were. So, you know, it served a function as far as winning the game was concerned, but it wasn't necessarily fun for me as the player. In this game, I'm going to have a lot more to do, I think partly because the map is a bit more favourable, but like I've said also, yeah, this enemy team isn't as good. They are approaching on this flank in a rather desultory manner, and I've also got these islands going for me. So, although there's no smoke, it doesn't really trouble me so much, and if nothing else, I know I can heal a lot more. Now, this is quite a heavily edited one, if you notice some of the jumps. And this one actually got to use some of the AP, which I didn't really get to show off in the previous game. Most of the time, the HE will be your go-to shell. I equally could have done that in a similar circumstance against the Shores with the London. But, of course, I'd have had to be a little bit closer to do it. But most of the time, yeah, you're going to want to use the HE, and as I've repeatedly said, the extra fire chance is really very noticeable, along with the extra damage the shells do as well. Now, luckily for me, as an HE firing cruiser, that Duke of York chose to extinguish a single fire, and that's all the worse for them, because although we did just lose that Benson, who kind of made a suicide run into the face of 3 enemy ships, they got their torpedoes away, one of which hits right on the bow, and so that Duke of York is now both flooding and on fire. And I'm just, meanwhile, I've been basically using island cover, using the slightly better stealth of this ship, 10.1 kilometers versus 10.5, to safely maneuver. And at this point, you know, we've pretty much won this flank. We've killed all their destroyers. This Duke of York is now extremely low health, and all that's left is the Hipper. And although my rate of fire, I don't think can quite match the Hipper, my fire chance is a lot better than theirs. So I'm relatively confident, and of course it's not just me, there's also other ships here as well. Well, that's a big difference between playing these two ships. London makes you feel very skittish, whereas Devonshire lets you feel, I think, a lot more confident, just even in the fact of having that better heal. So as far as I know, the armour groups are the same. The big difference visually between the two is the superstructure. Devonshire seems to represent a 1930s look with triple funnels, as you'll see there, and London, of course, only has double funnels and a rather more square superstructure, so I would guess that's a mid-war refit. And even though it's a mid-war looking refit, it has worse AA somehow. Not really sure why. The actual size of the AA envelope is the same for both. It's 5.8 kilometers, but yeah, this is slightly better in terms of its DPS, and of course has the defensive as well. So yeah, you can't even really say London has that going for it, even though it is the later refit. So this is just working this hipper over. Got 2 kills already, might get a third. I don't think my AP is going to do that well here. I mean, he's starting to angle away a bit, and because it's not an especially fast reload, yeah, I probably should have just stuck with the HE. You definitely feel that more with the London, though. It's a bit of a pain switching between shells. There are times when you miss out on lovely, perfect broadside squashy cruisers because you just have that long reload. And that's the same for the Alba, that's the same for the Pensacola. It's not unique to the London by any means. So that's the third kill, approaching 67,000, and there's North Carolina, one of the last few enemy ships pushing forwards. They've already killed what was a low health Monarch, and now they're just going to try and ram this very high health Monarch that's left, but yeah, they don't really have the wherewithal to, like, they don't have the hit points or the speed. It's not like they can speed boost in a French battleship. You do see French battleships sometimes doing that last suicidal dash with their speed boost to try and rush down somebody, and you know, it can be fairly effective. You've also got the secondaries on the French battleships blatting away as well, and the regular American secondaries aren't really quite the same. So I'm trying to get a fire here, but then I decide, as I am going to be fairly broadside, I might try some AP, but it's possibly still a bit too angled, so my initial thought is try and hit the bow plating, and then I decide to go for the superstructure instead. And it does some damage, but nothing overwhelming. The secondary's opening up as well, that's not going to add a lot. And the Nagato actually gets the kill from the south, and then all that's left is basically the Duke of York. So yeah, this was rather a condensed replay compared to the previous one, but I just wanted to give you some flavour of what the Devonshire is like. And this wasn't even an especially amazing game in terms of fire RNG. I've had much better ones in terms of the numbers of fires set in both this and the London itself. But yeah, just overall it feels like such a more effective package. So that was 83,000 damage done at the end there. No fourth kill, unfortunately. Would have been nice to get the Duke of York, but never mind. And rather better. That put me rather better in terms of score-wise. There we go, top of the team, 1,600 versus 1,200 and something in the last one. It's not impossible that you would have a game like this in the London, but you would have to work harder for it. You would have to get luckier with your fire RNG just to make up for that lower rate of fire, for the lower shell damage. And it's certainly possible, but you know, it's that bit less likely just because of the inherent characteristics of the ship. So overall, London is not bad, but it definitely falls into that category of disappointing free to grind ships. That really does seem to be the hallmark of any time you get these directives. And it's not like they're all unplayably bad, apart from maybe the Eitel Friedrich. Nobody plays the Eitel Friedrich. But, you know, in the same continuity as you find the Gorizia, well, yeah, and what other cruiser? There's been another cruiser they gave away as well, and I can't remember what it is now. Or am I making that up? I don't know. But, yeah, it's... I don't know, it's not interesting enough. The smoke doesn't make it interesting enough, in my opinion, to make it a truly good alternative to the tech tree ship, as you have with the Scharnhorst and the Gneismauer, which are kind of the gold standard in that regard. So yeah, overall just a bit disappointing, and it's kind of a low impact ship, especially when down tiered. But even when you're top tier, you know, for the armor you have, for the hit points you have, which I didn't even mention, they do have a pretty healthy chunk of hit points for being tier 6 cruisers. Yeah, it falls flat. So, you know, take from that what you will. So hopefully you have found this first look at the London, and to some extent the Devonshire as well, useful. And if you have, you can do all the usual things under the video down below. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.